The air hung heavy with a strange anticipation, a sense of normalcy on the brink of collapse. It was as if the world held its breath, waiting for something to shatter the quiet facade. That's precisely how I felt the evening my husband's father, Daniel, arrived on our doorstep. My name is Clara, and my life, until that point, had been unremarkable. I lived with my husband, Mark, and our 2 children in a quaint Washington town. Our house nestled amidst a sea of towering pines. The woods, with their whispering branches and dappled sunlight, had always held an air of mystery, of secrets shared in hushed tones. But I was soon to discover that the most unsettling secrets weren't hidden in the depths of the forest, but rather within the walls of my own home. Daniel's visit wasn't a complete surprise. He had mentioned it in passing some weeks ago, but the reality of his presence still caught me off guard. A renowned surgeon. He lived several states away and rarely had the time to visit. Yet, despite his demanding schedule, he always maintained a connection with his family, however fleeting. But this time, as I opened the door to greet him, a shiver of apprehension ran down my spine. There was something different about him, something that set him apart from the man I thought I knew. His eyes, usually distant and thoughtful, now burned with an unfamiliar intensity. A wave of dizziness washed over me, though I quickly dismissed it, attributing it to my own anxieties. Dinner was a subdued affair. Mark, ever the workaholic, recounted the latest happenings at his office, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that filled the room. The children, thankfully, were already asleep, their youthful energy a distant memory. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the turmoil brewing within me. I tried to concentrate on Mark's words, but my attention kept returning to Daniel. It wasn't anything he said or did, really. It was his gaze, a constant, unwavering presence that seemed to bore into me. Every time our eyes met, I felt a jolt, a strange pull that I couldn't explain. His expression remained impassive, yet I sensed a hidden depth, a simmering emotion beneath the surface. His occasional smiles, once comforting, now seemed laced with a knowing that sent shivers down my spine. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew thicker, the air charged with an unspoken energy. The light-hearted banter faded, replaced by a palpable silence that hummed with anticipation. The shadows deepened, enveloping us in an intimate cocoon. When Mark finally suggested we retire for the night, a wave of disappointment, unexpected and unwelcome, washed over me. A part of me, a rebellious, forbidden part, yearned to stay, to explore the connection that seemed to bind me to Daniel. But I said nothing. With a forced smile, I followed Mark upstairs, leaving Daniel alone in the flickering firelight, his silhouette a dark promise against the dying embers. Sleep was a distant dream that night. I tossed and turned, my mind a maelstrom of confusing emotions. Daniel's image haunted me, his intense eyes, his quiet strength, the subtle power that emanated from him. His voice, though he had spoken little, resonated in my thoughts, each word heavy with unspoken meaning. I tried to reason with myself, to attribute my restlessness to fatigue or stress, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something had shifted within me, awakened by his presence. A forbidden desire, a dangerous attraction, had taken root, and I was powerless to resist its pull. A terrifying sense of inevitability settled over me, leaving me both excited and terrified of what the future held. I was too afraid to put a name to the feelings swirling inside me. The next morning, I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. Mark and I sat down for breakfast, chatting casually about the day's plans. But I was acutely aware of Daniel's presence. His gaze lingered on me, as though he were trying to unravel the thoughts I dared not express. It felt like a silent game, a game with no defined rules, yet both of us seemed to understand it had already begun. When Mark left for work and the kids went off to school, I found myself alone with Daniel. The house was unusually quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind brushing against the trees outside. It was the kind of stillness that usually brought me peace, but today it only heightened my restlessness. I tried to distract myself with household chores, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. I caught myself listening for his footsteps, anticipating the faintest sound of his movements. Somewhere deep down, I realized I was waiting for him. He entered the kitchen while I was at the sink, washing dishes. His presence filled the room instantly, so powerful it sent a nervous jolt through me. I didn't dare turn around at first, but the air between us seemed charged, and I could feel my heart quicken. "Clara?" His voice broke the silence. It was steady and calm, yet it carried an undertone that made me grip the edge of the sink. I flinched slightly, unprepared for how deeply that single word would affect me. Slowly, I turned to face him, and his eyes locked onto mine. He was closer than I had realized, and a shiver ran down my spine. His gaze was intense, brimming with a quiet mystery that left me breathless. In that moment, I understood that whatever was happening between us was no longer simple or innocent. It had crossed an invisible line. The silence between us was palpable, heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, to reestablish some semblance of normalcy, but no words came. We were standing so close that I could hear his breathing, and it surrounded me like a cocoon. Inside me, a storm was building. I knew this wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something I couldn't control. It scared me, but it also drew me in. Daniel broke the gaze first, turning away as if to give me space to gather myself, but the moment lingered, etched into my memory. Even as I returned to my chores, his presence loomed over every second of the day. His voice, his eyes, the way he carried himself, it all stayed with me, like an undercurrent pulling me towards something I couldn't escape. As the hours passed, I tried to rationalize my feelings. Cleaning, cooking, folding laundry. I threw myself into every task, hoping the monotony would dull my thoughts. But it didn't work. Every quiet moment found me replaying his words, his glance, his nearness. I felt as though an invisible force was weaving itself around me, tightening with each passing second. By the time evening rolled around and Mark came home, I forced myself to act as though nothing had changed. I greeted him with the usual smile, chatted about the kids and the day's events, and prepared dinner as though everything was perfectly normal, but inside, I was anything but normal. Something had shifted that day, something dangerous and consuming. I knew I was standing on the edge of a precipice, yet I couldn't bring myself to step back. Every glance, every gesture from Daniel seemed to fan a growing flame inside me. I understood the risks, but I also knew that whatever had begun was beyond my control. As we sat down for dinner, the familiar chatter of family life filled the air, but my mind remained elsewhere. I felt like a marionette going through the motions, while the strings pulling me belonged to someone else entirely. The aroma of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air as we gathered around the dinner table, the familiar clinking of silverware against porcelain providing a comforting rhythm to the evening. Mark, my husband, launched into a detailed account of his day, his voice filled with the usual work-related stresses. I nodded along, offering the occasional, and, really? But my attention kept being drawn to the other man at our table. Daniel, Mark's father, sat across from me, a quiet observer to our mundane dinner conversation. His stillness wasn't the vacant kind, though. It was a watchful presence, an almost predatory awareness that sent shivers down my spine. His eyes, the same shade of blue as Mark's but with a depth that his son lacked, seemed to bore into me, making me acutely aware of every breath, every flutter of my pulse. "Clara," Mark said, interrupting my thoughts. You seem a bit distracted tonight. Everything all right? I forced a smile. My cheeks suddenly flushed. Just a little tired? I murmured, hoping my voice didn't betray the turmoil within me. After dinner, Mark, ever the creature of habit, suggested our usual evening stroll. But the thought of his casual touch, his easy affection, felt suffocating. I think I'll skip it tonight, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I have a bit of a headache. He didn't press, just gave me a quick kiss on the forehead and headed out the door. As it clicked shut behind him, a palpable tension filled the room. It was as if the air itself crackled with an unspoken awareness, a forbidden energy that pulsed between Daniel and me. He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, in a low, velvety voice that sent a tremor through me, he spoke. "Clara," he began, his tone a blend of concern and something more. "You seem different somehow. Distant." His words pierced through my carefully constructed facade. How could he see so clearly the turmoil I was trying so desperately to conceal? I felt exposed, vulnerable, and strangely excited. "I'm fine," I managed to say, my voice a strained whisper, but the lie hung heavy in the air between us. Daniel didn't respond, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, continued to hold mine captive. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken desires and forbidden longings. I felt a desperate need to escape the intensity of his gaze, the weight of his presence. "I think I need some air," I blurted out, rising abruptly from my chair. Without waiting for a response, I fled the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Outside, the cool night air offered a welcome respite from the stifling atmosphere inside. The moon cast long, eerie shadows across the lawn, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I wandered aimlessly, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and desire. Daniel, Mark's father, the thought of him sent a thrill of forbidden pleasure through me. He was older, wiser, with an air of authority that both intimidated and captivated me. I had always admired him from afar, but this was something else entirely. My feet led me to the old wooden swing set at the edge of the woods, a relic from Mark's childhood. I sank onto the worn wooden seat, the chains creaking softly beneath my weight. As I swayed gently back and forth, I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling within me. But the quiet solitude I craved was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the tall, imposing figure emerging from the shadows. It was Daniel. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and graceful. Without a word, he sat down on the swing beside me, the chains groaning under his added weight. The silence between us was charged with an unspoken tension, a palpable awareness of the forbidden attraction that hung heavy in the air. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to break the spell that seemed to have been cast over us. But the words caught in my throat, trapped by the intensity of his gaze. He turned to me then, his eyes searching mine, and in that moment, all pretense was stripped away. The desire, the longing, the forbidden yearning, it was all there, reflected in his gaze. He reached out, his hand gently cupping my cheek. His touch was electric, sending shivers of anticipation down my spine. "Clara," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "I can't deny it any longer. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The words hung unspoken between us, heavy with meaning. We both knew that we were crossing a line, venturing into dangerous territory. But the pull was too strong, the temptation too great. And as his lips met mine, I knew there was no turning back. We were falling fast, into the depths of a forbidden love. He didn't utter a single word, but his eyes spoke volumes. That look held a language of its own, one that pierced through the silence between us and revealed truths I wasn't ready to confront. I couldn't tear my gaze away, couldn't summon the will to leave. It was as if we were two magnets pulled toward each other despite the impossibility of it all. My breathing quickened, and I worried he could hear the erratic rhythm of my heart pounding in my chest. In that moment, fear consumed me, not of him, but of myself. I was terrified of the undeniable pull I felt toward Daniel. The attraction had grown too intense, too overpowering, and I knew that if I stayed any longer, I wouldn't be able to resist the force drawing me to him. Sensing my turmoil, Daniel was the first to break the connection. He turned his gaze away, letting it rest on the dark, still waters of the pond. The tension between us began to ease, replaced by a bittersweet disappointment. I had wanted him to make the first move, to let the spark between us burst into flames. But perhaps he understood how dangerous that would be. For both of us. "It's peaceful here," he said at last, his voice calm and measured, as if nothing had happened. "Yes," I managed to reply, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to regain control over myself. "It's a good place to think." When his eyes met mine again, I knew this was just the beginning. The intensity between us hadn't diminished. It had only been tucked away, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Despite the fear, despite the risk, I understood with startling clarity that this night was merely the first flicker of a flame that would inevitably blaze out of control. We sat there in silence a while longer, the cool night air beginning to wrap itself around us like a warning. Finally, I stood, and Daniel followed suit. Without speaking, we walked back to the house together, the unspoken weight of what had transpired hanging between us. The quiet of the forest was replaced by the stillness of our home, where the lives we had always known were waiting. But I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. When we returned, Mark was already fast asleep. I climbed into bed beside him, feeling the lingering chill from the forest clinging to my skin. Though I closed my eyes, sleep refused to come. Instead, I lay there in the darkness, listening to Mark's steady breathing as my thoughts churned. I couldn't shake the certainty that this night had set something unstoppable into motion. My life was no longer my own, and the path ahead promised nothing but danger, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The next morning, I woke with a sense of inevitability. The events of the night before felt vivid and real, more than just a fleeting moment. It was as if the forest itself had conspired to weave that encounter into the very fabric of my existence. The memory of Daniel's presence at the pond lingered like an echo, coloring my thoughts and actions. Everything seemed ordinary as I moved through my morning routine, but it all felt different. Mark had left early for work, and the kids were off to school, leaving me once again alone in the house with Daniel. On the surface, the day began as any other. I busied myself with chores, cleaning and tidying, but the air felt charged with an energy I couldn't ignore. Every glance from him, every quiet movement he made, sent ripples through me that I couldn't explain. It was like the world around me had been painted in sharper, brighter colors, and I couldn't escape the heightened awareness that consumed me. Daniel's presence wasn't just noticeable, it was electric, coursing through the air between us and making every mundane task feel like a prelude to something greater. As the day wore on, I realized I was no longer fighting what I felt. Instead, I was waiting for the inevitable moment when the fire we had ignited would break free from its fragile confines and consume everything in its path. I tried my best to avoid him. The memory of what had happened by the pond was too vivid, too powerful, and I knew that if we found ourselves alone again, it would only repeat itself. This time, I wouldn't have the strength to resist. Yet, no matter how much I tried to stay occupied, I couldn't escape the awareness of Daniel's presence. I could hear his footsteps in the neighboring rooms, feel the energy of him close by. and it enveloped me like a suffocating fog I couldn't shake. As the evening drew near, and the last golden rays of sunlight painted the sky, I heard his voice calling me from the living room. His tone was calm, casual even, but I knew it was just a mask, concealing something deeper, something we both felt but hadn't dared to name. I walked into the room, trying to muster confidence, but my heart betrayed me, racing uncontrollably. Daniel stood by the window, his figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the setting sun. He didn't turn immediately, but tilted his head slightly, acknowledging my presence as my footsteps approached. "Clara," he said softly, testing my reaction with the sound of my name on his lips. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to appear composed. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind outside. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, I moved closer to him, closer than I had intended. The space between us seemed charged with an unspoken energy, dense and almost suffocating. Daniel turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I knew there was no escaping what was happening. The fire that had sparked between us was now blazing, impossible to ignore or contain. His gaze was so intense that it sent a shiver coursing through my body. "Why are you avoiding me?" he asked, his voice gentle yet piercing, as if he already knew the answer but needed to hear it from me. I drew in a shaky breath, trying to collect my thoughts, but they scattered like leaves in the wind. I couldn't lie to him, couldn't pretend that everything was fine when the truth was so raw and undeniable. "Because I'm afraid," I admitted, my voice barely audible. Daniel nodded slowly, as though he understood exactly what I meant. His eyes softened, but they didn't release me from their hold. He took a step closer, and I felt his hand brush against mine. A light, almost imperceptible touch, yet it sent a storm of emotions surging through me. My pulse quickened as I looked up at him, our gazes meeting in a way that spoke more than words ever could. He moved even closer, his breath warm against my skin, and I couldn't look away. The thin line that had kept us apart was dissolving, fading into nothingness. Deep inside, I knew what was happening was dangerous, wrong, but I also knew I wanted it. I wanted him. Daniel's hand lifted, his fingers grazing my cheek with a tenderness that sent goosebumps rippling across my skin. My heart thundered in my chest, so loud I was sure he could hear it. But there was no turning back. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming to resist any longer. He leaned in slowly, his eyes darkening with passion as his lips moved toward mine. My mind screamed at me to stop, to step away, but my body betrayed me. Instead of retreating, I took a step closer, feeling his hand tighten gently around my face, and then, finally, his lips met mine. The kiss was like nothing I had ever experienced before. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an escape, a release from all the rules and constraints that had bound us. His lips were soft, warm, and they ignited a fire in me so intense it took my breath away. Every fiber of my being told me this was wrong, that I was crossing a line I could never uncross. But in that moment, I didn't care. I couldn't care. Daniel's arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer as if anchoring me from falling deeper into the abyss I had willingly stepped into. The kiss deepened, filled with a passion that had been hidden between us for far too long. My body responded with the same intensity, every touch, every movement awakening a desire I couldn't suppress. His hands roamed gently across my body, igniting a wave of longing that left me breathless. In his embrace, I felt both lost and found, consumed by a connection that defied all reason but felt inescapably real. It was wrong, so incredibly wrong, a betrayal of everything I held dear. Yet, in that moment, all those thoughts faded into a distant hum. All that mattered was the raw desire that surged through me, the undeniable yearning for the man standing before me, Daniel. His eyes, usually warm and friendly, now burned with an intensity that mirrored my own. We were both caught in a silent storm of forbidden longing, the unspoken words hanging heavy between us. And then it happened. He leaned in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that ignited a fire within me. It was a kiss that shattered boundaries, a collision of two souls who had danced around their feelings for far too long. When we finally broke apart, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. The taste of him, the feel of him, lingered, leaving me breathless and wanting more. "Clara," he breathed, his voice husky with a mixture of desire and apprehension. "We shouldn't." He trailed off, the weight of our transgressions settling upon us. But I couldn't let him finish, couldn't let the moment slip away. Driven by an insatiable hunger, I reached for him, pulling him closer. Our lips met again, this time with a desperate urgency. It was a kiss that spoke of stolen moments, of hidden desires, of a passion that could no longer be contained. His arms tightened around me, his body pressed against mine, leaving no room for doubt, no room for escape. And in that embrace, I lost myself completely. The world outside our bubble ceased to exist. There was only Daniel, his touch, his taste, the intoxicating scent of his cologne. We were playing with fire. I knew. This stolen kiss, this forbidden indulgence that would have consequences. It was a turning point, a precipice from which there was no return, but in that moment I didn't care. All that mattered was the overwhelming desire that consumed me. When we finally pulled away, the reality of our situation crashed down upon us with the force of a tidal wave. My chest heaved, my mind reeled, the world spun. We had crossed a line, shattered the fragile facade of normalcy we had so carefully constructed. Daniel's hands lingered on my arms, his touch sending shivers down my spine. His eyes, dark with passion just moments ago, now held a flicker of fear, a hint of regret. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with unspoken words and the heavy weight of our actions. "We need to think," he finally managed, his voice strained, the words catching in his throat. I nodded, unable to speak, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Guilt warred with desire, fear with excitement. The familiar world I knew had been irrevocably altered, and I was adrift in a sea of uncertainty. He took a step back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm that now separated us. His gaze darted around the room, avoiding mine, a clear indication of his inner turmoil. He, too, felt the weight of our transgression, the knowledge that we had embarked on a dangerous path. "We need to talk," he repeated, his voice firmer this time, though laced with a tremor of unease. This shouldn't have happened. We both know that." I nodded again, the gesture heavy with unspoken truths. A sharp pang of guilt pierced through me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the lingering warmth of his kiss, the memory of his touch. He was right. Of course, this shouldn't have happened. But it had. And now, we were left to grapple with the consequences. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But what now?" He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and longing. He didn't have an answer, and neither did I. We were both lost in a labyrinth of our own making, with no clear path forward. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, the sharp sound of the front door opening sliced through the tense silence. My blood ran cold. Panic seized me, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. It was Mark, my husband, home early. I froze, my mind scrambling for a plausible explanation, a way to conceal the truth etched on my face. I couldn't let him suspect. Couldn't let him see the guilt and desire swirling within me. I glanced at Daniel, who had instinctively retreated, his expression carefully schooled into one of neutrality. But I could see the panic in his eyes, mirroring my own. Mark's footsteps echoed through the house, each step drawing him closer to our tangled web of deceit. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to compose myself. Whatever had transpired between Daniel and me would have to remain hidden, at least for now. The moment of truth had arrived. Daniel's expression shifted instantly, his face adopting a calm, composed demeanor as if nothing had happened. "Clara, I'm home," Mark's familiar voice called out, his footsteps drawing closer to the living room. Daniel glanced at me, giving a subtle nod as if signaling that our conversation was over, and stepped aside. I stood frozen, a storm of guilt and fear raging inside me, my heart still pounding from the intensity of what had transpired moments earlier. When Mark entered the room, his warm smile met mine, and I forced myself to return it. "Hi, darling," he said, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. "Everything okay?" I nodded quickly, unable to find my voice. My emotions were a tangled mess, and I was terrified he might sense something was wrong. But Mark, preoccupied with his own thoughts, seemed oblivious. He launched into stories about his day at work, his energy light and casual, entirely unaware of the turmoil beneath the surface. Daniel stayed in the room for a few minutes, listening politely as Mark spoke. Eventually, he excused himself, claiming he needed some time to unwind. I watched him leave, my chest tightening with anxiety. What would happen now? The rest of the evening unfolded in a surreal haze. I did my best to act as if nothing had changed, engaging in small talk and watching a movie with Mark. He seemed pleased that the family was together again, completely unaware of the chaos brewing inside me. While I smiled and nodded, my mind kept drifting back to Daniel, his kiss, his touch, the weight of his words. By the time night fell and Mark and I went to bed, the guilt was suffocating, lying beside him. I felt as though I couldn't breathe. The betrayal, the undeniable wrongness of my actions, pressed down on me like a heavy stone. And yet, the memory of Daniel lingered, vivid and inescapable. His kiss burned in my mind like a brand. His touch lingering on my skin like a poison I couldn't purge. I couldn't stay in bed any longer, careful not to wake Mark. I slipped out of the room and made my way to the porch. The cool night air greeted me, sharp and refreshing against my flushed skin. I leaned against the railing, staring up at the dark sky dotted with stars, searching for answers in their distant light. But no clarity came. Inside, I felt empty, torn apart by the weight of what I'd done. The silence of the night was profound, but it only amplified the echo of my thoughts. Our kiss couldn't exist without consequences. It had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Now, I had to face the reality of what it meant for all of us. For me. For Daniel. For Mark. I didn't know how much time passed as I stood there, lost in thought, until I felt the light touch of a hand on my shoulder. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat, and found Daniel standing behind me. His face was tense, his eyes filled with a mix of worry and resolve. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice barely breaking the stillness of the night. "We need to talk." I nodded, realizing there was no point in avoiding this any longer. Without a word, I followed him as we walked into the garden, where the dark silhouettes of trees surrounded us, their shadows hiding us from view. Daniel stopped beneath the trees, turning to face me. His eyes met mine, and I felt my heart begin to race again, a relentless drumbeat I couldn't control. "This shouldn't have happened," he said, his voice tight with tension. But I can't pretend there's nothing between us. I don't know what to do, Clara. But I know one thing. We can't just go on as if nothing has changed. His words struck me like a blow, and for a moment, I was at a loss. He was right. Everything had changed, and there was no way to turn back the clock. But what could we do? How could we possibly navigate this without destroying everything around us? What are we going to do? I asked finally, my voice trembling as fear and uncertainty washed over me. Daniel stepped closer, and I felt his hand brush against mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, but I could feel the same hesitation, the same doubt, reflected in him. I don't know, he admitted, his voice thick with pain. But I know one thing. I can't lose you. I can't. His words trailed off, his gaze searching mine. But I also can't betray Mark, he finished, the conflict in his voice unmistakable. I looked at him, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily between us. We were standing on the edge of a precipice, one step away from falling into something that could destroy us both. And yet, the pull between us remained, undeniable and impossible to ignore. The humid night air hung heavy with unspoken words, amplifying the weight of Daniel's statement. We need to decide how to proceed. I stood frozen across from him in the moonlit garden, my voice caught in my throat. The truth was undeniable. Our forbidden encounter had shattered the fragile facade of normalcy, leaving us stranded in a no-man's land of illicit desire. There was no turning back, no erasing the memory of shared breaths and stolen touches. We were teetering on a precipice, bound by an undeniable connection, yet trapped by the devastating consequences it carried. The decision before us was agonizing. Sever the ties that bound us and attempt to reclaim a life that felt impossibly distant, or surrender to the forbidden, plunging headlong into the unknown. Each path was fraught with peril, demanding careful consideration. The garden was our confessional, the whispering leaves and chirping crickets, the only witnesses to our turmoil. An oppressive silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the frantic beating of my own heart. 1,000 emotions warred within me, each vying for dominance, leaving me speechless. This was uncharted territory, a raw, visceral experience that threatened to dismantle the very foundation of my life. Every possible choice felt like a betrayal, a sacrifice. "We can't go back," I finally whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Acknowledging the truth aloud was both liberating and terrifying. But I don't know how to move forward. Daniel's eyes, shimmering with unshed tears in the moonlight, mirrored my own inner chaos. We were both prisoners of circumstance, ensnared in a web of forbidden longing with no clear escape. But even as I grappled with the impossibility of it all, a startling realization took root. I couldn't imagine a life without him. The guilt, the obstacles, the potential for devastating consequences. None of it mattered. Our connection transcended the boundaries of right and wrong, of societal expectations and familial bonds. "We'll find a way," Daniel declared, his voice a beacon of resolve in the darkness. "But we have to be honest with each other and with ourselves." His words were a lifeline, infusing me with a strength I didn't know I possessed. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, the destination unknown, but I felt an unwavering conviction. I was ready to face whatever lay ahead, hand in hand with him, no matter the cost. We walked back to the house in silence, the unspoken words hanging heavy between us. Everything had shifted. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a silent acknowledgement of the forbidden desires that now bound us. We were no longer simply father-in-law and daughter-in-law. We were two souls entangled in a dangerous dance, forever connected by a secret that could destroy us both. Dawn broke, casting a somber light on the turmoil within me. The events of the past few days, the stolen glances, The accidental touches, the whispered confessions in the garden, pressed down on me with the weight of reality. I could no longer deny the truth of my feelings, nor could I pretend to be the woman I was just days ago. Mark, my husband, Daniel's son, had already left for work, his early departure a cruel reminder of the life I was jeopardizing. The house felt different now, imbued with Daniel's presence like a lingering scent. I moved through my morning routine mechanically, attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but my thoughts were a whirlwind of forbidden desires and conflicting emotions. Daniel consumed me. His image burned into my mind, his voice echoing in my ears. I busied myself with household chores, scrubbing dishes with a ferocity that bordered on violent, desperately trying to distract myself. But it was futile. The tension in the house was suffocating, growing with every passing moment. I could hear Daniel moving about, feel the intensity of his gaze whenever he passed by. The air thrummed with unspoken words, unacknowledged desires, and I knew I couldn't bear it a moment longer. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I had to make the first move. These feelings, simmering beneath the surface for far too long, threatened to consume me if left unchecked. I wouldn't suppress them any longer. With a trembling hand, I tossed the dishcloth aside and drew a deep breath. Then, with a newfound determination, I walked towards the living room. Daniel sat on the couch, his posture rigid, his eyes distant, lost in his own thoughts. But the moment I entered, his gaze snapped to mine, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. His eyes, a mirror to my own soul, reflected the same burning desire that raged within me. The air between us crackled with unspoken longing, a silent conversation that needed no words. We were two magnets, drawn together by an invisible force, and in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I moved towards him, each step deliberate, each footfall echoing in the sudden silence. The space between us shrank, charged with an anticipation that was both exhilarating and terrifying. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and in that shared look, we acknowledged the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface. Words were unnecessary. Our intentions were clear. The air crackled with tension as I moved closer to Daniel, each step sending a jolt of electricity through my veins. The room was hushed, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within us. Our eyes locked, a silent conversation passing between us, filled with unspoken desires and forbidden longings. In that moment, I knew resistance was futile. The magnetic pull between us had become an irresistible force, and the reflection in his eyes mirrored my own surrender. He rose to meet me, his powerful form closing the distance in a heartbeat. We stood mere inches apart, our breaths mingling in the charged space between us. The warmth of his body radiated against mine, sending shivers down my spine. His hand gently found its way to my shoulder, a touch that sent a cascade of heat through my core. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us suspended in this bubble of forbidden passion. With a soft groan, Daniel pulled me closer, his lips crashing onto mine with a hunger that took my breath away. This kiss was different, raw and untamed, fueled by the yearning we had suppressed for far too long. It was a release, a confession, a surrender to the undeniable connection that bound us together. My body responded with an urgency I couldn't deny, every fiber of my being yearning for him. His hands moved over me with a possessiveness that both thrilled and terrified me. He kissed me as if time were standing still, as if this moment was all we had. And in a way, it was. We were stealing these precious seconds, defying the boundaries that society had imposed upon us. I lost myself in the intensity of his touch, the world outside melting away into insignificance. His fingers traced the curves of my body, igniting a fire within me that burned with an insatiable hunger. I didn't resist as his hands slid beneath my clothes, my own desire mirroring his. this moment was ours, a stolen sanctuary where the rules didn't apply. With a strength that belied his gentle touch, Daniel lifted me into his arms, my legs instinctively wrapping around his waist. His eyes, dark and intense, bore into mine as he carried me down the hallway. Each step was a delicious torment, a slow burn of anticipation that made my heart pound in my chest. He laid me down on the bed with a reverence that made my breath catch in my throat. His gaze held mine captive, a silent promise of pleasure reflected in their depths. I reached up, my fingers tracing the rugged lines of his face, memorizing every detail as if I could somehow imprint him onto my soul. Our lips met again, the kiss deepening, becoming a desperate exploration of need and longing. Daniel's lips trailed a fiery path down my neck, his touch leaving a trail of goosebumps in its wake. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the exquisite sensations that rippled through me. Every nerve ending tingled with anticipation, every touch electrifying my senses. I couldn't hold back any longer, the dam within me breaking, unleashing a torrent of emotions I had kept bottled up for far too long. He was a master of seduction, his movements a symphony of passion and tenderness. His hands explored my body with a reverence that made me tremble, each caress a whispered declaration of desire. With every kiss, every touch, the world outside ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us entwined in this forbidden embrace. Time became meaningless as we explored the depths of our passion. The fire between us raged, consuming us both in its intensity. My body responded to his with an abandon I had never known, matching his every move, every thrust. This was a point of no return, a crossing of boundaries that could never be undone. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care. In that moment, nothing else mattered but the way Daniel made me feel, alive, desired, completely and utterly. As the haze of passion clears, the weight of what Daniel and I have done weighs heavily on us. The silence is heavy. The reality of our choices is unfathomable. This is only the beginning. And we both know there is no turning back. The storm we have unleashed will change everything. Comment number 2 if you want to hear the rest.